There was a lot of emphasis on hard work, always telling the truth. That probably came out of my own parents and the Roses as well. They would have all been the same way.
What was your childhood like?
In those days, a lot of the young girls would go to university to find a husband, and then they would quit school. And I was so offended at that. I thought, what do you mean quit school? No, I'm going to get my degree. I'm going to have a career. Even though we lived in a nice house in La Jolla, I hate elitism. I've always hated elitism, and I wanted no part of that for you kids, no part of that.
After the divorce, do you think I had a lot of anger issues on the back of that?
I mean, divorces always hurt kids, but I really wanted to minimize it. Yeah, I mean, I crashed and burned. His parents and my parents were both married 50 years plus. That was my reality. And so when I did confront your dad, you know, I was a mess. And then I got that idea to go to Europe, that I had to run away. It was really good for me. Had a lot of time to think and opened up my world.
When I was 7, you told us about the divorce, and I think for some reason with my personality, I was just like, I just built these walls all up around me at that time, and that was just like,
yeah.
So it was like,
yeah.
I think I just built these walls up, and then I think I realized I was just trying to keep people out of my life so they wouldn't hurt me. Yeah.
I'll give you a hug right now. If you are patient, become the opportunity for doors to open that most fit your journey, and you're on that journey. I'm really, really proud of you.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... Let's be honest. Everybody would like to sit down and have a long conversation with their mom. And this was something that after 8 years of asking, I was finally able to sit down with Betty Rose, the woman that raised me as a child, that brought me into this earth, and talk to her about everything in her life, from growing up as a young girl in Arizona, to marrying my father and moving to California, to then divorcing my father when I was 7 years old, the trauma that I still struggle with, to becoming a woman who raised 3 children on her own, taking them all around the world, introducing them to cultures and places, and going on to be this incredible woman who still travels to this day to places like Antarctica, Iran, and North Korea. Betty's just an incredible woman. She's very private, but she allowed me into her home to tape this episode, and we went really deep about really personal things. What the divorce was like for her, what it was like for me, how she raised her kids. She also goes through a lot of her ancestors and where they came from, what it was like growing up on a farm in Arizona, and how she looks at the future as she goes into her 70s. This was a special episode for me, and I hope you really enjoy my episode with my mom. All right, so we are here in La Jolla, California with my mother, Betty Rose, and she's been really generous and kind to take some time out and go through some old albums of my grandparents, great-grandparents, pictures of me as a munchkin, pictures of us growing up, and we're just going to go through these albums and talk to each other, and hopefully I can hear some stories about my mom growing up and what it was like, and my grandparents, and to hopefully get a little bit more of a feel of the Roses and the Benedicts, and then also maybe a little bit about me and my childhood, so maybe I can understand me more and what I was like to deal with as a young boy, as a punk boy, and all that stuff. So, so welcome, and thanks, Mom, for doing this.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
So where do we start? You have a lot of albums here.
Yeah.
You're very good at keeping records of things.
Well, thank you. I was somewhat delayed, as I had told you. I had these stored in a nice, actually beautiful wood cedar box that my brother, Jimmy Benedict, had made in wood shop in 7th grade. And he made it for me, and it's all cedar lined and all, and I had all my pictures just stowed in there for decades. So I won't go through how the albums got made, but it was put together by someone else, and I'm grateful that I have those. So I think the story that I want to start with my mother, who was from Chicago, and how did she get out to Phoenix, Arizona to go to what is now Arizona State University? It's kind of a funny story in a way, because her mother lived in Chicago. She invested in a few small houses and had some rentals, but she also liked to travel with this pretty radical group in those days, in the 1920s and 30s, called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So it was this pretty radical group that went and spoke against alcohol and drinking. Well, when she was in, I know, which is
a bit ironic.
Yes, it is ironic, and we'll talk about why.
This is my great-grandmother.
This is your great-grandmother. And so what happened is, when she got to Phoenix, she thought this was beautiful. I mean, they call it the Valley of the Sun. It was clean. It was, you know, there was a desert, and a few hours north there's a forest. And so she really, really wanted your grandmother, Lois Smith, to go to Arizona State College, which she did.
And that's quite a ways away from Chicago.
Yes. I mean, it would have been a train trip away, and you would not go home again till summer, which she would do. And then she was a waitress at the B&C coffee shop on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. She did that every summer because she had to help earn the money to go back to school.
That's your mother. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And so my great-grandmother had traveled out to Arizona on the temperance movement, trying to get people to stop drinking.
Yes.
And this is before Prohibition, or right around Prohibition?
Well, it would have been after Prohibition. But, you know, in those years, hard drinking was a serious problem, especially in big cities like New York and all in those times during the Depression and that. I've learned that from the Ken Burns series. I didn't realize just how much of a social problem it was. But the humor in this story is that Lois Smith, who became Lois Smith Benedict, came out, and she had a scholarship from the WCTU to get her there. And she had to also work, and she did ironing for 10 cents a shirt. And that's how she earned her money. Well, so your grandfather, Jim Benedict, was in the Aggie Club because he was always going to be a cattleman. So this club was going to have their picnic. Now, these would be all guys that would either be going into cattle or farming. And so they dared him that he wouldn't have enough nerve to call that cute girl Lois Smith and ask her to the Aggie picnic.
The girl from Chicago.
Yes, the girl from Chicago.
The big city girl.
Yeah, the big city girl. And he was never one to pass up a dare. So he went to the phone and called her, and she accepted. That's how they met and how they went to that picnic. All right, so they started dating after that. And he once took her to a new film in Phoenix, and it was called The Gentleman from Arizona. And before the film started, he leaned over and he asked her, "Do you know a gentleman from Arizona?" And she said, "I'll tell you after the movie." And so that was their...
Is that her way of saying, keep your hands to yourself?
Yes, I think so. Be kind of saying, well, we'll see how you act, you know, and then I'll let you know the result afterwards. So they dated for the next 2 years. He was 2 years older, so he was graduating from university. She had finished her sophomore year, and they decided to be married, which they were in 1942, but it galled him to marry her. He had to pay off the WCTU loan. And Jim Benedict was a pretty big drinker. So he had no use for the WCTU, and yet he had to pay off the loan to have his bride. So those are a few of the funny stories. One other story he would tell us is after 1 year of dating, he decided he better get to Chicago to meet the family. They were pretty serious and to do that, and he had to sell his best horse, and he never forgot it. He never forgot that he had to sell that horse for $250 for that train fare to Chicago. And so, of course, it was all in good fun because they married in Flagstaff, and their honeymoon was at the Grand Canyon.
What a great place for a honeymoon.
Yes, and they had a long marriage, more than 50 years. It was a very happy and long marriage.
And just going back like one generation further, what were some of the family values of the Benedicts and then of your father's parents and then your mother's parents? Like what kind of families were they?
Well, first of all, I would say that they were very hardworking. I mean, there was no question, and that probably could be said about that generation. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that was what you did. And agrarian careers was about all there were. Unless you were trained as a medical doctor or an attorney, you probably were a farmer or a rancher. There just weren't a lot of companies or corporations that did hiring. So there was a lot of emphasis on hard work, always telling the truth, and if you said it, you did it. When we talk about Jim Benedict, I'll tell you the stories of how he would do cattle deals and how there were no written contracts in those days. So I would say from those parents, that was what you found. Okay. And they always wanted a better life for their children, treated people well, always welcomed everyone, any race, any ethnicity, were always welcome. Okay. That was the way we were taught in our home. So I know that was what they learned in their homes.
Okay, and a man was his word. That was really important.
That's right. If your word was good. And I'll jump over to Jim Benedict because we're going to talk about him next. He would make these cattle deals on the phone with buyers in Texas. And honestly, there's that saying that if your word wasn't good, you'd be run out of Dodge. That's literally what would have happened. If you did not honor your word that you were going to ship 100 head of cattle to Texas for this amount that they negotiated on the phone, no one would have done business with you again. And that was just the moral ethics of work in those days, and people honored it. They either honored it or they were run out of Dodge.
Right. So if you were still around in those days, it meant you had a history of standing by your word.
Yes.
And I felt that with your parents and then the Roses as well, who came from farmers, agrarian. There was just no BS, no nonsense.
If you said it, you did it. Yeah.
And
no exception.
And you said there was a story in the late 1800s as well about education.
Yes. So what that story, that was a tragedy on the Benedict side of the family that changed our life forever. And so what happened was that, all right, so Jim Benedict was born in 1919. And he was one of 5 children, and his mother was Getha Munns Benedict, and his father was Oliver Avery Benedict. Now, Oliver Avery Benedict was from a dairy farm in upstate New York. How did he get to Arizona? It was a very interesting story. So there was a man in Camp Verde, Arizona, which is where Grandpa was born and raised, and there was a man in that town named Boss Head, and he had a general store. And he knew this family in New York, and he wrote a letter to them saying, we'd like a nice, strong boy to come out and work. That meant you took the train out, and it was forever. I mean, you basically moved. But the eldest son in the Benedict family was already betrothed to Mary within a year. So they went to the second son. That was Oliver Avery Benedict. He came out. He worked at the general store. And so that's how the New York Benedicts came to be the Arizona Benedicts, was that. And when he did that, my guess is that would have been also about late 1800s or around, I would say, between 1895 and 1902, something right in there. And I do have more accurate records in my office, because one of Grandpa Benedict's brothers, Uncle Joel, he was really the historian of our family. But anyway, he came out. So, but the tragedy in our family that changed the view to education forever, because Oliver Avery Benedict was not educated. He probably went through a grade school education in those days. Maybe he went through 6th grade, possibly 8th, but I doubt if there was much more, because those boys had to work on the dairy farm after that. And so anyway, but what happened to Getha was that her mother and father, I should go back to her mother. Her mother, who would have been Grandpa Benedict's grandmother, in the 1860s, her family moved out permanently from Missouri. And you saw a lot of westward ho in those days. Why? Because they had gold mines in Northern California, and they needed farming. They needed beef. They needed to have people settle these lands so that they could basically support the growing population in Northern California around the mines. And so what the government did was they said to these families from Missouri, if you'll go out there in your covered wagons and take all your stock and everything, you can settle the land. And if you improve it over the next 3 years or 4 years, what does that mean? You'll build a kind of a house. It could be simple. You'll fence it. You'll have some irrigation. You'll have some livestock. And then you can sell that cattle to people then that would drive it up to the gold mining, which would have been in Northern California. And that became the only way that people of that generation could afford to have land. They couldn't buy land. I mean, there just wasn't a money economy in the mid 1800s. It didn't exist.
Would they give them the land?
Yes.
After a certain amount of time?
Yes. So they would come out, which they did. They went to Cornville and Camp Verde, those areas. And it would be on a temporary basis until you could prove to the government that you had improved it. Now, what I should do is read a book on exactly what were the stipulations. I don't know that. And it could have varied from state to state, but I just know in Arizona that that's what brought them out. Now, my grandmother, who was named Harriet Loy, they called her Hattie, she was 10 years old. So she would walk the entire way. Only people who went in the wagon or the stagecoach would be pregnant women or infants. Everyone had to walk. And her job was to pick up the dried cow pies along the way, because that would be your fuel for the night when you built your campfire and cooked your food.
So she walked from Missouri to Arizona.
Yes. And all of the adults would have as well. All children and adults, unless you were too small and you'd get a break in the stage. And so
hard times.
It was. So they did that, and they improved the land, and then the land was deeded to them. So the federal government at that point would actually issue a deed, but there were these stipulations that had to be made. So that's how they got to Arizona.
Okay.
Now, when Harriet Loy, Hattie Loy, grew up, she raised 2 girls. One was your great-grandmother, that would be Jim Benedict's mother, Getha, and her sister. They were 18 months apart, and she and her husband raised them. That was James Thomas Munns, and so your Grandpa Benedict was named after him, James Thomas. They married, and he was a cattle man himself, but what he did was go and buy cattle and then drive them home. So he was gone for a few months at a time. He'd go to Oklahoma or Northern California, or other areas and buy the cattle and then drive them home. And so I actually have some letters of him to his wife, you know, how are the girls and this and that. But here's what happened. There was a tragic accident in the 1890s. So Harriet Loy was 5 hours away. They were picking cherries with the two girls. They were 7 and 8. That would be Jim Benedict's mother and his aunt. And so James Thomas Munns mounted his horse. They all had rifles on their horse because it was the days of the cattleman-sheepman's war. The cattlemen and the sheepmen did not get along because if sheep graze, they pull up all the roots. If you've ever read anything about Yosemite, you'll see that really destroys the land. If cattle grazing just takes the tops. So they had a lot of fights about land and where you could open graze or not. And when James Thomas Munns mounted his horse, his loaded gun accidentally went off and shot him dead. He was 30 years old. His wife was 27 with these two little girls. So someone got word to her and she got home. And there was no way for a woman of 27 years old without an education to earn a living. There was really no way, a proper living. I mean, you couldn't be a bar girl or a dancer. It really wasn't, you know, you were allowed to be brought up as a proper lady. So her brother moved in with her. He was not married, and he moved in, and then he farmed the land. And the best that we can understand is that she raised those girls to get an education, that this would never happen to them. And the reason we know that is that this little town, Camp Verde, which is still not very big today, it's 1 hour south of Flagstaff, Arizona, she decided that they would go, once they graduated high school, and my grandmother was 18 months older, so she got held out of school and waited for her sister. Then they would go down to what is now Arizona State University, but in those days it was called Tempe Normal School. So it was a teacher's college, a 2-year teacher's college. So the girls were afraid of two things. Number one, that when they went to Flagstaff to take the examination, they wouldn't pass. They didn't know about how their high school education in, you know, little rural Camp Verde would measure up. That was number one. And how would their dresses look with the rich crowd in Phoenix? Those would be the sons and daughters of politicians, doctors, lawyers, those people that would have far more money than they would. And so they passed their exams, and their mother went with them, and there would have been no roads or dirt roads, and it was a 5-day journey from Flagstaff to Tempe, Arizona, which is basically the outskirts of Phoenix, and their uncle would have driven the buckboard down, and then their mother kept school for them for 2 years. And the girls went to school. They graduated in 1904. They got their teacher's degrees. They came back to Camp Verde, and they now had an income. That was how important education was. So they started teaching, both of them, and within a couple of years, they each met their future husbands and married, and that's how she married Oliver Avery,
okay,
Benedict, and so my cousin Harriet and I, who's named after our namesake, right? We only figured that out in the last 10 years. That why we really came from very modest roots. How did this get shifted toward college education is important? And we really looked back and we knew it was really because of that very sad and tragic incident in our family that we can thank. Because all 5 children in your grandpa's family all got college degrees. It was required.
Which was rare for that time.
Very rare, and especially from Camp Verde. And they all went down to ASU. And the older 2 brothers, these would be your grandpa Benedict's brothers. One was the superintendent of a whole school district, Tempe School District. He worked his way up as a teacher and then became superintendent. And the second brother, who became a Navy pilot during World War II, he became a professor at ASU. And he was the first professor to film an ASU game, a football game in 1951. I mean, cameras were very new in those days, and especially moving film. And he was the first to do that. He retired as a professor there, always in photography and film. Then the next person was Lois. She was the only girl. There were 4 boys and 1 girl. Lois became a teacher, and she taught in Jerome during the really wild days of the copper mining. And I mean, this was a place where I admire her that she would be as a single woman there, because it was just a lot of hardworking copper miners that probably weren't so nice, right? So she did that. And then there was like this 8-year gap, and then your grandpa was born, and 2 years later, Uncle Sam, and they became the agriculture part. So your father went to university, like all 5 of them did. So did Uncle Sam, 2 years younger. And he was really the entrepreneur of the family. Your grandpa was the one who worked hard, first just working for a ranching outfit, and then he really liked cattle, and he ran a feedlot in Phoenix, and he saved up his $10,000, and with a partner, he bought the feedlot, the Benedict, feedlot in Casa Grande, Arizona, between Casa Grande and Stanfield, and that was their big move in 1954, that they would do that. And he owned it for a number of years, really, and then his brother came on board, Uncle Sam, and that Uncle Sam later bought it from him when he wanted to retire.
Right, and they became very big in the feed business, right?
They did, and he was, again, he ran 10,000 cattle in that feedlot, and again, the buying and selling was all done on the phone and all over the U.S., but because not only are you buying mostly from the western states, you're also selling for those people that want to ship that they go to market, the cattle, and then they're made into beef products. So your grandfather was a very astute businessman. I think he became probably the most successful of the 5, if you really want to talk about business-wise. And years later, after he passed away, I met a man who had worked for the Forest Service for years and knew him because of the Bardee Ranch, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And he said to me, your father, I admired him as a businessman because he once said to me, in life, you need to know when to push forward and when to pull back. And pulling back is just as important as pushing forward, depending on what decisions you're making, maybe how the economy is looking, what are your risks. He was not a risk taker. He really wasn't. He only invested in what he knew, which were cattle, grain futures, feedlots, and ranches. That's it. He never bought a stock or a bond in his life. Never would have. So.
And what was Grandpa like? I mean, I know he got a hip injury when he was young.
Yes, he did.
Which kept him out of the war and also kind of gave him a handicap.
Yeah, he drove a buckboard to school in high school, and while that was healing. A wagon. Yeah, a wagon and the horse, and that. He outgrew that. I mean, as an adult, he really was fully ambulatory until years later in his 50s, and he had a stroke. Right. But then, even then, though, I mean, he never complained. He had his golf cart. So you probably remember when we'd go to October roundups when they gather the cattle before they go to market. It's always a big deal because all the ranchers come and help to sort the calves. He was always in charge. Jim Benedict was the boss. You knew it, even if he wasn't a golf cart or that. So he had his sayings. He had a couple of funny sayings. He would say, Camp Verde, where the road ends and the west begins, where men are men and women are damn glad of it. They would always say, cash is cash is cash. And do you remember how in his pocket he'd always keep
like $500.
Yeah, and in $100 bills, right? And you'd always try to grab one, and then, so that, and he was always thinking in his mind about the next venture or the next whatever. But, he was very successful. He loved his work. He only read cattle magazines and anything about that. He didn't really care much about anything else. You did some filming of him, you know, with a camera.
Yeah.
And asked him stories, and Grandma too. And
those were the first London Real episodes.
Yeah, they really were.
'Cause I was interviewing him and Grandma, and they would tell stories about skinny dipping, or Grandma would tell stories about Chicago. And yeah, you've got those. You sent me those tapes.
Yeah, and I was so glad you did that. I had had a good commission year at this company I work with, and I thought, well, we need a new TV, and why not get a camera that you should describe what that recording box was like.
Because you had, this is after the divorce, so you were out there working again, you went into sales, you started doing well, and then you bought us a video camera and a VHS recorder. And to make movies, you had to literally drag around this big brick hanging, and then a big camera that would click in there, and then you could just press record and stop.
Yes.
But we loved it, and I started making movies with my cousins in Arizona on the ranch.
Yep.
Grandpa was in some of the movies. He was like the villain.
Yes.
And then we would always shoot videos, and and then I started interviewing them. I must have been 10 years old, maybe. Something like that?
Yeah, you were young. I would say that you were about that, because I know I know the years I worked there, and it was, but what was interesting about you, Brian, is that you right away had the vision of what this should be. You know, you were already the director. You know, you were already doing London Real. You just didn't know it. And you would have the concept, and then you'd tell everyone their parts, and then your cousins in Flagstaff would act in it, or Eric would be a part of it, but you were definitely the director. But I mean, you did it in a nice way. You had the ideas, so.
Yeah, there's one of those videos where you can hear after I cut, I'm like I'm kind of micromanaging in the background. I'm like, all right, that was really good, but now we need to do it this way. And so, yeah, I'm like doing that.
I'm glad that was in there.
And then we shipped in the talent, like my cousin Vic, who was really a ham in front of the camera.
He was good.
Yes. So then I was just behind the scenes.
One of those you did when we were at the lower headquarters, and we were on that swinging bridge. You did one of those on there, you know, which is, you know, it's just, all it is a walking bridge with each side of the canyon has a rope, and that's it.
Yeah.
And then you did some parodies of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and Vic acted it, but you directed it.
Yeah, we called it Mr. Rogers' Ghetto.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
We thought it was really amazing.
Yep. I sent those to Jude and also Vicki. Although when I got those and upgraded them into CDs, I sent them to them too.
Okay.
Yeah, you had some good interviews of Grandpa and Grandma as well in Sedona.
I was amazed how good the audio was and how good everything was.
It was fun. Yeah, that was good. But I mean, really, I just gave you the cameras. I said, if you want to have fun with it, you know, you really took charge. It was all your ideas. So that was fun to see. And one time when I was at work, Jeff, our neighbor, came, and you guys cooked up to go into my closet. You got a red dress out, and he sang like Madonna. He put the dress on. Do you remember it?
I remember that.
And unfortunately, that got erased.
Okay.
Darn.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it would get re-recorded over, but later I tried to find it, and it was like, oh, I wish I had that. Because I think you showed it to me, but it got taped over.
Yeah, we used to make the Ninja videos and the Michael Jackson videos.
We still have the Ninjas, I think, got saved, because you guys were running up the slope. Because we had the slope, you know, on outside our front door. Then we had the slope of the next. And I remember seeing Jeff, like, and then you were filming him.
And anyway. What was Grandpa like as a father?
Okay, so, you know, he was very protective of us. He wanted Lois Benedict, his wife, to never have to work in her life. He was just adamant that she be the housewife and mother. He really was serious about that. So he got insurance policies that made sure that in the event of his demise, which never happened, that she would be cared for. And that was really a big thing for him. The other was he had a very strong work ethic always. I mean, he was up at 4 especially in the summer. They'd go an hour early because it was hot. And he'd go to work, and he'd, you know, come home at night, and he'd have us pull his boots off, right? You know, it was like, and that was always something we would do. And really, Grandma ran the house, the kids, everything else, which they were a great team. He needed her. He really needed her because he was focusing on the business. As far as with the kids, he was fun. I mean, he'd say those funny things, you know, he would joke. He would, when they had the castration of the calves, he'd bring those home and make his huevos. Okay, so, you know, you dip them in egg batter and then you roll them in flour and then you fry them, and that was always a novelty. Yeah.
Okay. You get used to that, I guess, on a farm. Or
yeah, right. He liked, you know, he liked his kids to be into things, you know, interesting. And you know, Jimmy was kind of a kid who was just a little boy, liked his trucks. And I think that Jim Benedict was a little hard on him. I think he was. Hey, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think it's just because he was a boy, he expected more. I don't know why. I mean, when you're kids, you should just be kids. But I think it was a little hard.
He was his only son, and he was
it's his only son because I was first. Jimmy was 2 years later, and then when I was 11 and Jimmy was 9, Jude was born. We'd already moved to Casa Grande then because he had bought the feedlot, and so. I think that was, but I will say though that in the winter of my father's life, he really respected Jimmy. He really did. Jimmy was one of these guys that could do anything. He loved tractors. He collected John Deere tractors. He had 5 vintage John Deere tractors that he kept out at the ranch, and he could do anything. He was a big gun reloader, which he did with Tom Rose. And they were always best of friends. So the Rose family and the Benedict family was fun that way because they were really best of friends in Flagstaff, Arizona. And his career was he was at NAU in Flagstaff, and he ran the paint department. So basically, he was the head of that department. Yeah. And that was his career.
And what was your mom like?
My mom she loved being a wife and a housewife. Loved it. She loved cooking. She was a very good cook, and she loved sewing, which I think she was a little disappointed I didn't go into as much as she would have liked me to. But she was a really happy, upbeat person. She, as I mentioned to you before, she was very interested in international news, so she read Time and Newsweek cover to cover. She watched the news programs. She talked about these players, and I remember her saying those names: Stalin and the Soviet Union, and Korea, and all of that. And she also, there was something about her. I wish I could ask her this question now, but we had a television. And if she thought when Jimmy and I were changing channels that it was a soap opera, she would run in there screaming. She hated soap operas. She would never let us watch them. We had no interest anyway. I still don't to this day. But I wish I could ask her why. Like, did she see them when she was young, or did she just hear about it? Well, she wouldn't have seen them because TV came in. We had our first TV in 1951. So somehow she thought those were just too sleazy, and she didn't want us watching them. I just remember that.
So she was very worldly.
Very worldly, and just a loving mom, really there for us. I thought she really emotionally was very concerned, protective, interested, and so was Jim Benedict. So was my dad as well. But he was very busy in his work.
Okay. I remember Grandma she always had crafts for us and arts, and we're going to make this today, we're going to do this today, she always had something going on. She would be up early in the morning, cooking like crazy. I mean, she would cook for, 100 ranch hands and stuff like during Roundup. And so always upbeat, always super cheerful. Everything was always okay. There was always a solution to everything. And that's what I remember about Grandma.
There was something funny that happened. She had a mynah bird, you probably remember. And I think she had probably in her life a couple. But anyway, this mynah bird would laugh like her because she was the one that was home all day. Right. And so when it would laugh, it sounded like her, And And then whenever and they're very smart birds, so when she would talk, it would have her voice. So one day, Grandpa's brother came to the door, Uncle Sam, and he knocked on the back door. Nobody locked their doors in those days in Casa Grande, Arizona. And he knocked on the door, and he heard Lois's voice, "Come in!" And he goes in, and she's not there. She, you remember the house. You walk into the dining and kitchen area and the living room are all there, and she's not there. But she said, "Come in." And so he called out, "Lois," and she was in the back bedrooms and came out, and she says, "Oh, Sam, you're here." And he said, "Well, you said come in." And she said, "No, that was the bird." So that really happened. So,
yeah, she always had some really weird pets and stuff.
She did.
Her.
She loved her dogs. She had a whole history with dogs through the years.
Yeah, she liked her Chinese
so
bugs.
it was fun.
And so, are there any pictures in here we should? Well, so you talked about Oliver and Avery.
I think that's pretty
much. And then
much
this is a picture of your parents, the wedding. Here's Jim with his shirt off at Tucson, Arizona.
Yep.
And
their wedding, their honeymoon, and then his years, with the ranch. Just a quick story on the Bardi Ranch. When he worked as the foreman of a small cattle feedlot, the owner of that was a large vegetable farmer north of Phoenix named John Jacobs, and he mostly grew broccoli and carrots, and just this small feedlot. Well, we lived there, and he asked your grandpa to help him find a cattle ranch in Arizona. So they went all over the state, and they found the Bardi, and they liked it because although they only owned 800, John Jacobs bought it, he only owned 800 acres. It had 64,000 acres of forest land, and it was only 5 miles wide, but it was 20 miles long. So you had your upper headquarters, which was where we were at the Bardi, in the summer months for summer grazing. And then when winter came, the cattle had a natural drift pattern down to Sedona and Camp Verde, where you had grazing in the winter. And so for open and natural grazing, you had a lot of feed for your cattle. And your worst fear is there'd be a drought and you wouldn't have enough water, because if you have to haul water, you're not going to make it. After John Jacobs died, his daughters came to my father and said, "Would you like to buy that ranch?" And he said, "Yeah, that's the best cattle ranch in Arizona." So he bought it and had it for another 20 years. So it was a very
beautiful place.
Very nice story. Yeah.
And I used to visit probably a few times a year.
Yes.
You used to put us on the plane in San Diego and then just send us.
Yes.
We were like munchkins, and then they would pick us up at the airport in Phoenix at a different time, right?
Yes.
And then we would go and, in the upper headquarters and lower headquarters, we'd ride motorcycles. We'd build, floats in the drinking ponds of the cattle, and we just run rampant.
Run around, yeah. And in October, we'd almost all go over for the roundup. That was a big thing when we'd see all the cousins and all.
Yeah.
And then
Easter
in the
was
spring,
big.
Easter, we'd have the Easter egg hunt at the lower headquarters.
Where you would dress me up in funny costumes.
Yeah.
I've got those pictures.
Yes.
Yeah.
But at least you got to go hunt Easter eggs.
Yes.
So
that was fun.
Yeah, so that was pretty much their life. They eventually sold the house in Casa Grande and the feedlot to his brother Sam, and then they moved up and built a house in Sedona. Right. And that was nice because it was closer to the ranch, cooler weather. And that's
house.
Where they lived there, and that was what was right under that.
And Grandpa had a stroke when he was in his 50s.
Yes, he did. But he never. What I loved about my mother is she totally empowered him. I mean, even when he was still in the hospital, when you call, she'd put him right on the phone, and he was always the decision maker. And she was wonderful that way. She was such a supportive person that allowed him to always be the person he was.
Right.
So
even though he was in a wheelchair, he just kept going.
Kept going. You never
Everything
heard
was
him.
Business as usual. He'd wake up in the morning, we'd get him in a golf cart or get him up in the truck, and he would just keep doing business. There was never any quit in him or complaining.
No complaining. He was always in charge, and everybody admired him. And he was a good guy. Yeah, and the neighbors liked him. The neighboring ranchers. The Forest Service really liked him because he would improve the property. And some of the ranchers couldn't do that because they'd inherited the land, so they were land rich and money poor. But because Grandpa had worked hard and been careful with his funds, he could build fences where they would like that to happen, and keep the water reservoirs up and that. So yeah, so they were great. They were great role models, and of course they still believed in education and made sure that we all went. And then, you know, it was that came down from 1898, and to this day I still see all of the children of my generation seeking university. I'm really grateful to at that time, that would have been my great-grandmother that would have, you know, suffered that loss and then changed that course for our family.
Right. So because her husband died, it kind of forced education on everybody, even me.
Yeah, she felt that her daughters needed to have a career and a way to earn money, that she didn't want them to be in the situation she was in.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.